While I'm waiting for Twitch, I should post sent. Let's see if it starts to show up. Ooh, hey, that's an ad. All right, waiting for that to start up. Oh, hey, I can probably go to my laptop camera for a minute. Get my book ready. Wow, this is a long ad tonight in Twitch. I wonder if I paid for a pro subscription if I could stop watching ads in Twitch. All right. Hi, chat room. Got a few viewers, not too many yet. Well, you can probably hear my puppies in the background tonight. All right, so we're going to be talking about the box model all week. Everything's a box. While we're waiting for everyone to join, remember to post questions in the chat room. It looks like someone is already asking about the journal, and I would be happy to talk about that a little bit. It's probably the most intense journal that we've had, and that's because it's kind of like preparation for the midterm, so we can definitely talk about that. I want to start out by talking about the box model, though, by just giving you a quick demo of all the things that you've learned about so far that you can kind of put together to make something that you see on every website. So the box model, if you've done some of the assignments, really consists of three things: borders, margin, and padding. And there's a diagram in the textbook where you can see where the padding area is, where the margin area is, and how the border is in between that. And on this week's quiz, you'll probably have to dissect a few of those diagrams, if I remember right. When you combine the box model properties with what you already know about color and background, and then you just add in a few of these extra things that are covered in this chapter as well, like border radius or shadows or different display types, you can actually build a navigation bar. And every website has a nav bar. I'm sorry, someone in the chat room said something got unplugged. Can everyone hear me? I'll wait until I hear that everyone can hear me. I had to reset up my whole setup of equipment tonight because I had disconnected everything and changed every single setting for that live stream last week in the classroom. That was tough to put together. I hope the audio and the video wasn't too bad and you were able to watch the color lecture. So anyways, like I was saying, if you add, yes, people say they can hear me. If you combine these concepts, you can build a real life nav bar. And so I wanted to just spend a couple minutes today showing you how you can put that together, what HTML tags to use, what CSS properties to use. And we're going to start out with a very simple nav bar. In fact, you know what? Let's start out completely from scratch. I'm going to delete what I have in here. So this is essentially, I'll even delete this. This is essentially just the HTML starting point from Atom. I gave it a title, navbar fun, and I put in a H1, navbar, fun. And if I save this and I open up the page, you'll see there's nothing on my web page yet, but we want to add some stuff. So let's set up the HTML, and on it, underneath the covers, most nav bars these days are enclosed by the nav tag, the nav elements, opening and closing. And that's just so that that part of the web page is labeled as navigation. It's really helpful for screen readers to be able to know the different regions of the page so that it can jump to the navigation and read aloud all the major links. Inside of a nav bar, the most common thing that I've seen in my life is a list of links, because really that's what a nav bar is, just a list of links. So my favorite list for that is the unordered list, because really no link is more important than the other. They're just going to be lined up on the page. So you know the unordered list, I'm putting that in here. Then it's a series of list items, so I can just type in a few of these. We'll just do 3 for our demo today. And let's say I want to link to Google and Apple and Mid-Michigan College. If I save that and refresh, three links that are not clickable yet. So we need to make these clickable. And I'm just going to indent these a little bit so that we don't get too confused by the tags that I'm putting in. So how do I make these links? The A tag, yeah. In order to make something go to an external website, I have to give the whole URL. Oops. Turns out that I know Apple is apple.com, and everyone knows that Mid-Michigan College is midmich.edu. So this probably doesn't look like most nav bars that you've seen. So let's figure out how we can make that look like a nav bar with just a spot of CSS. So let's add some CSS. My favorite thing to do is actually make an external style sheet. It's pretty common, so that you can share that style for the nav bar on all pages of your website, so you don't have to copy the same CSS into every page. So of course I added the CSS, but nothing's in my style sheet yet. So let's prove that my style sheet is working. Let's change something with the nav. Last week we learned about color, and we learned about background color. So let's make blue. So we got a blue nav bar. You know, it's really hard to read that. So let's change the color of all of my links inside of there to be white. And you know what? I don't like how blue's looking. Let's do gray. It's a little bit easier to see. You can actually see that I still have my bullet points. So this isn't too far from where you were before last week with color. However, it doesn't look like a nav bar at all. So with just a few CSS properties built onto here, we can dramatically change the appearance of these links. The first thing that we want to get rid of are these dots. We don't really have bulleted lists inside of a nav bar typically. So that's one of the properties that's been, I think it's been covered in a couple chapters by now. But that's a property that is either on each li or it's on the ul. All right. So I could actually say ul to select all the ULs on the page, which might be a little bit overkill. We'll come back to that towards the end here. It's list style, and it's actually a style type. Oops. And you'll see Adam says it specifies the appearance of a list item, and it's going to autocomplete to none. Look at that. Those dots are no more. They are gone, 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 gone. However, this padding still exists, and I sometimes get confused. Sometimes I forget if it's margin, and I'll refresh and it'll say no, it's not. So let's try to get rid of padding. There we go. So it is padding. Now they're just a list of links without any bullets. So we're getting there. What properties do you think we could adjust to make this more like a nav bar? In the chat room, what box model properties have you been playing around with that you think would help with a nav bar? I've already tried color, and I've tried background color. What other properties can you suggest? I've already tried color. Crickets in the chat room. Well, let's start with trying to get. Oh, someone's saying a double dash line. I think that's part of the border. So let's try a border. Let's put a border around the UL. We'll put a 1 pixel dashed blue border around here. It's kind of hard to see, so let's make it much bigger. Look at that. I added a border. Now that's around the whole nav bar. I want to focus on the individual items for a little bit before we finish styling the whole nav bar. Look at how close together Google, Apple, and Mid-Michigan College are. What property do you think I could use to adjust that? Border is definitely something that we will come back to, but I'm just going to comment it out for now. If we wanted to focus on making this look more like a nav bar, what do you think I could use? Maybe some padding. I don't like how the gray is touching the white. If I put padding on the UL, that's actually going to add it to the outside of everything. And I actually might, at least on my phone or on my desktop, I might want to have a bigger clickable area. So what I like to do is actually add the padding to the anchor tags themselves. So up here where I change the color of the anchor tags with this descendant selector, all the A tags underneath the nav, I'm going to actually add padding on here. And I'm just going to add an M around each side. And that started to add some padding, but it looks like it only added it on the left over here and probably on the right. So this is where one of the topics that I wanted to get to today comes into play, and that's the display types that are covered. Display types are specified by default for just about every element that you add. A paragraph tag is a block element. If you remember back, the block element is something that takes up like the whole width of the page, and it means that if you have two block elements, they're going to each start on their own line. If something's an inline element, that's something like an anchor tag or the strong or the highlight or the emphasis tags. Those are tags that actually will be used inside of a block element or a paragraph. Even the image tag is considered inline because it will not cause a new line automatically. That's why it's called inline. So every tag that we use implicitly has a display type. And to prove to you that this has a display type, let me pop open our good friend, the Web Inspector. And I'm going to make sure that I select this anchor tag. And if I scroll down, you'll see the CSS that I've written first. But if I scroll down far enough, we will get to LI right here is display list item. And I was hoping that I was going to see that the anchor tag itself is a display inline, but it looks like list item is what is winning out here. So these, in particular the A, which is a display of inline, cause the padding in the box model to only be applied to the sides. In order to add padding on the top and bottom and actually have it affect the items around it, that has to be applied to a block element. Now what's cool about the display types is you control that yourself with CSS. So if you go back to Atom here and you play around with these A tags, you can actually change the display to something else. And there's a lot of different possibilities. The ones that we're playing with today are block and inline and none. So if I change this to block, you'll see that all of a sudden now the padding surrounds the top and the bottom and the left and the right. And if that's not obvious enough, let's add a border in here. So let's just add a 1 pixel red, solid red. And this is something I like to do. I just like to add borders so I can see the element. You don't necessarily have to use CSS like that. You can use the Web Inspector. If you've gotten pretty handy with it, when you hover over any one of these elements, like the anchor tag, you'll see that it highlights exactly what you're looking at. And it shows you a breakdown of the box model. It kind of color codes it in green and in blue here. And if I go over into the web inspector and I scroll down in Chrome, you'll see that it actually shows me the diagram for the box model. It shows me the content, shows me that there's padding all around it. It shows me that there's no border, that's what these little dashes mean, and it shows me that there's no margin. So someone had talked about increasing margin size. You definitely could increase margin size if you were going to maybe have a line of buttons across the page, but I think it's actually pretty common for nav bars to use padding mostly instead of margin. Now someone did mention display inline. I think that display inline would be really valuable if we wanted to get these buttons to line up next to each other. That's what I'm going to focus on next. And actually, what we have to override a lot of different things here. This display block itself might not be the best option. There's actually an inline block option, and I'm going to apply that not only to the nav A but also to all the list items, because that's going to change them to line up next to each other. So I talked about inline and I talked about block. People often wondered, why can't I have the best of both worlds? Why can't I have margin and padding on the top and bottom like a block element, but why can't they also be displayed in a line? You know, why do they have to start one on top of another? So the wonderful W3C and browser makers have adopted this combination, this like best of both worlds solution where you can have an inline block. And the way that I discovered this was actually with autocomplete. One day I noticed that there was inline block and I just tried it out, and that allows the items to stand next to each other. Now, what else does a nav bar need? If we're talking about selectors, which I linked to a lynda.com course about selectors, it's very common that you might want to have some sort of hover effect. So let's try that. That's a pseudo selector that usually goes on the A tag. So I'm going to actually just copy this nav A selector and change it to be a nav A hover. And I'm going to leave all the properties the same, except I'm going to change the background color to black, let's say. And the color itself of the text, oh, you know what, the color's already white, so it's probably going to be okay. Yeah, so now if I hover over, I get an awesome little effect. And this is where I wanted to point out why I added the padding onto the anchor tag instead of the LI items. This navbar would pretty much look the same if I had the padding around the LIs, except this hover effect is only going to change the background color of the anchor tag, and it would be much better to have that whole section of the navbar change colors. So I'm going to put that back underneath the anchor tag itself. Now when you're specifying a pseudo selector, remember that this nav A is actually selecting the anchor tag, and then this nav A hover is also taking effect. I don't have to list all the properties again because this is just going to override the background color of the anchor tag when it's hovered over. And you can see that with the web inspector. If I refresh this and I open up the web inspector and I select one of these links, that link right there. You know what? I clicked on the link. That's why it took forever to load. Let's inspect it this way. So you'll see that the color, the background color, isn't even specified on the anchor tag by default. But if I click on this little hover icon in the web inspector, I can actually pick what pseudo selector I want to be active. So I can actually pretend that the hover has been activated over the Mid-Michigan College link. And when I do that, you'll see that this nav A selector is still taking effect. We're still making the color white. We're still putting the padding on here. But then this other rule suddenly takes effect that makes the color black. So that, my friends, is a very simple navbar. A few other things that you might see pretty commonly in a navbar is getting rid of the underline. You can actually control that with text decoration. You can say none, and now there's no underline in there. Maybe you want to have some spacing in between these, so you could actually put like a margin right. Margin can be specified all around it. So if I do, like 1 pixel of margin all around, that added some space all around. But if you just wanted that on the right, you can say margin right 1 pixel. And now there's a little bit of space in between these two, which is a little bit hard to read. Let me actually change this background color to some other gray. So now you see that there is 5 pixels, or one, how many pixels did I say? Margin right, 1 pixel in between each of these. If I made that 0, they would get a little bit closer. Huh. I'm surprised that there's so much padding there. Wonder where that's coming from. Let's take a look. Oh, the LI seems to be adding something of its own. Background color red. When I'm playing around, I'll often change some of the colors just so I can try to see how they bleed through. And actually, one of my favorite properties talked about in this chapter that I listed in the outline is the outline. It's like border. It takes all the same properties as border, but it doesn't add to the width when it's calculating the whole width of the element. So I like to use that nowadays, now that I learned about it, to troubleshoot. So I might add a border or an outline onto these. So an outline 1 pixel solid red. And that doesn't affect... Yeah, it's really weird how there's this spacing in between each of the elements. I'm not sure where that's coming from. It looks like it's coming from the LI itself. I really thought that those would be touching. Well, that was fascinating. So the outline is a very cool property to use. This is just one style of nav bar. You might want to change it up, and instead of having like a background color across the whole nav, you might want to actually put a margin on each side. So like a margin left and a margin right, and a background color gray. Because then you can have a series of buttons that line up next to each other instead. If you find yourself specifying a margin right and a margin left, there's actually a shorter way to write that, and our textbook comes up with a pretty good mnemonic for remembering it called trouble. You can specify all of the margin values and all the border and all the padding values in a single statement. So instead of margin right, margin left 5 pixels, I could actually write auto, so this is top, right would be 5 pixels, bottom, you can say auto, and then left would be 5 pixels. And you can actually write that even shorter, because if you see the duplication, you can actually just write auto and 5 pixels. So all of these lines all equate to the same value. If I refresh, you'll see that it's exactly the same as if I had written the two values, margin left and margin right. I traditionally have always preferred writing margin dash right and margin dash left, because I used to get confused between whether trouble was clockwise or counterclockwise. So I don't mind if you decide to write them margin dash right and margin dash left. Sometimes that's easier to adjust after the fact. So this is one style of nav bar. Of course, you don't have to use inline block. You could actually change these to block. And then everything would kind of stack on top of each other. Then you can choose to specify a width. So you could set a width of like 200 pixels. And now you've got a good left-hand nav bar. Let me go back to this version of it. Square, but square is kind of too traditional. There's this awesome way to adjust a border called border radius, and you can actually, you know, specify a small value, and it kind of rounds the corners a little bit, or you can specify, you know, a bigger value, and it rounds the corners more. It eventually reaches like a maximum, and it turns it into just like a capsule, like you're seeing here. It rounds it like 100%, I think might be the limit. Oh, I guess it can go even more than 100%. But generally, I see a lot of people use like 5 or 10 pixels just to have a soft rounding of the button corners. So that's another variation on the nav bar. Let's see. Can you embed a scroll bar within the nav in case you have a large amount of nav links? It's a very good question. There are ways to control that. So if you had like 10 or 20 links, it would scroll horizontally. I see a lot of people try to avoid that. Instead, you'll see it's more common to, you know, have like a drop-down menu kind of appear, so that when you hover over one, more links will appear. We're not quite there yet. I think you could probably piece it together with some pseudo selectors right now, but I'll leave that for later in the semester. What I really wanted to show you is that with just border, padding, and margin, you can make a decent nav bar. I mean, it's not the prettiest. You could pick a gradient, or you could pick different colors and different fonts. But I think you're at the place now where this technique of just changing a list into list style type none, and changing a few of these display properties from block to inline, or from inline to block, or this happy medium of inline block, you could do some cool things with the Zen Garden. So let me go through my outline, make sure there was nothing else I wanted to mention. We talked about borders and margin and padding. I showed you border radius. We talked about trouble as a way of remembering the order of the shorthand properties. I think I showed you how you could do margin, but padding is the exact same way. Maybe you don't want the same padding in all 4 values. So the way it goes is top, right, bottom, left. So maybe we want top of like 5 pixels, and a right of 10 pixels, and a bottom of 50 pixels, and a left of 75 pixels. This is going to be the weirdest looking button ever. But, you know, you can make a nav bar however you want. So that's how you can specify padding in one line, but the equivalent version would be padding left 5 pixels, padding top. See, already I'm messing up trouble. Padding right 10 pixels, padding bottom 50 pixels, and padding left 75 pixels. That should be the exact same. Yeah. But yeah, see how you can make some fun things just with a few CSS properties? Go back to something more traditional. No, I forgot to get rid of that padding. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. All right, so that was about half an hour. Let me go back to the outline. Oh yeah, there's also box shadows. I frankly have not played around with box shadow nearly enough. I do know that box shadow takes a couple values, and I wish I had the plugin for Atom that showed me what those values were. If I just Google search for box shadow, it'll take me to the Mozilla Developer Network. Oh, there's a lot of different ways you can specify box shadow. Looks like if you click around, you can see what the different values do. Looks like you can actually use a comma and specify multiple box shadows. That's pretty cool. I like this one. So offset X, offset Y, color when it's 3 values. When it's 4 values, it's offset X, offset Y, how to blur it, how much to blur it, and then the color. So this one right here must be offset 12 pixels to the right and 12 pixels down. And then it's got a 2 pixel blur. Oh, actually, that's more. That's a blur radius and then a spread radius. So it blurs it just a little bit, and then it spreads it just a little bit. So let's borrow this code here, paste it in, and see what our nav bar looks like. So at this point, you can actually use the web inspector to maybe get the desired box shadow that you want. So first, I am not all about this blue. Let's try mixing and matching some color values here. Okay, that's a light purple, but let's actually make it show through a little bit more. And maybe I don't want it so far over, so we'll make it like half that distance, 6 pixels. So it's only dropping down a little bit, but let's blur it more. Yeah, let's have it 10 pixel blur radius. And the spread, I'm not really sure what spread does. Oh, spread makes it like expand out more. So if I make that 10 and instead I make the blur radius 100, you'll see that the radius is how diffuse it is, and the spread is like how much ink to put down, I guess is how I would describe that. So we'll make that just like 1 pixel. So that's a little bit subtle. Now you could change that box shadow on hover if you wanted for a different effect, or maybe what you could actually do is take that box shadow entirely and maybe make that your hover effect. So it looks really flat by default, but then when you hover over it, it kind of pops out. So yeah, lots of cool properties here. I talked about outlines. Outlines are just like borders. What I will say is that they're great for debugging because they don't affect the width. How do you know they don't affect the width? Well, this little diagram down here shows you the box model for whatever you're inspecting. It actually shows you the calculated width and height as well. So this Mid-Michigan College link is actually wider. It's 145 pixels wide than this Apple one. Apple is shorter, so it's 39 pixels wide. If you added the outline onto here, it wouldn't actually change the width. If you add a border, it does change the width of the whole element. And we talked about the display types. So those are the pieces of the box model that I wanted to experiment with. I will now go take a look at the journal. This is the midterm planning journal. And I want you to browse the Zen Garden. The Zen Garden is an awesome collection of designs. And the cool thing about all of these designs, and the links are here on the left, you can actually use the links on the left, or the second link that I put inside of the journal is to a blog post that contains a little thumbnail preview of every single Zen Garden design. In fact, one of my favorites is this robot named Jimmy. If you click on it, you'll notice that it loads the Zen Garden / a number. So you could actually just type in a different number up here in the URL and get a completely different design. All of the content that's on 215 is the same as the content that's on number 77. Well, apparently 77 isn't a valid number, so maybe you don't type in random numbers like I just did. Let's click on the beauty of CSS design. This is number 217. This content is the exact same HTML tags, same content, same everything. The only thing that's different is they link to a different style sheet. So I want you to poke around in these designs with the web inspector. Try to figure out what makes them tick. You've learned a lot about box model properties, so you'll probably see a lot of borders and backgrounds. You'll probably see some of those display types being used to change something from a block to an inline, or from an inline to a block. I love the Zen Garden. It is just a fun way to design to show what CSS can do to design a web page. So your actual midterm project, which is not yet, this is just a preview, is to make your own Zen Garden design. So what I really want you to do is browse through a bunch of the Zen Garden designs, find your favorite 1 or 2, and actually I think I say find your favorite 2 designs. Talk about what you like about their designs. I will tell you that I love a few of these to death. Like, I love this one because of the way the colors interact with each other. You'll see that they're slightly transparent. They have that alpha transparency, so the yellow and the blue and the gray kind of all combine, makes it look like it's layered. I love the use of padding on here. You'll see that there's padding that makes all the content stand out and be easy to read as you scroll down the page. I love the fonts. There's a term in graphic design called white space, and that's kind of what you see. Yes, there's some actual white space, but any spot that is like a blank color that doesn't show text is considered white space. And I just love how they've pieced this together. The robot one, I see a lot of students talk about the robot one because they've added the spinning graphic as a background, and they've made it so that the robot is fixed. As you scroll down the page, it looks like you're covering him up with a blanket. This one, I love how the list of other designs is laid out down here. So I want you to browse through a bunch of designs, find your favorites, talk about what makes them unique, what you like, and then I want you to talk about the pieces of the box model that you see in action. And you can actually open up the web inspector to say it has a border of this and actually list the properties. I see lots of white space, and that's implemented with padding, like I said earlier. And then find 3 other CSS properties. You know, we've touched base on color and box model and a bunch of other ones. I can guarantee you that every design that you look at is going to have a few CSS properties used to great effect. When I talked about the web inspector, I encourage you to take those values and just play around with them. You can do that with the Zen Garden design. If you want to see what this web page would look like, let me go back to the beauty of CSS design. If you want to see what this web page looked like without the transparency, like if you wanted this yellow color to not be transparent, I am pretty sure I can just inspect that element. It's this aside right here, and I could change it from 0.9 to 1. So now it's not transparent at all. Or maybe I want to make it super transparent. I guess it's not as legible, but I can talk about these CSS properties in my journal, how they're used, how I tweak them, what I would do if it was me. The last aspect that's kind of unique to this journal is I want you to look at the selectors. This is what's going to prepare you most for the midterm project, is you're going to have to write CSS that targets different elements on this page. And for the nav bar that I built today, I used very generic selectors. I didn't use any IDs or classes, but I'm hoping that you'll get practice with that in the lynda.com course that I linked to. On the Zen Garden, you're going to notice that everything on their pages has like an ID attribute or a class attribute. So if I look, let me try to zoom in here. This, I zoomed too far, my friends. This section right here, you see it contains this, it's highlighted green and yellow and orange over here. This section has a class of intro on it, and it also has an ID of Zen intro. That means that they're able to actually write CSS selectors over here that will target that element and only that element on the page. And if I uncheck this width, let's see what changes when I uncheck that width. You'll see that the content now spills over. When the width was set to 66%, it stopped it from overlapping. So I want you to pay attention to these CSS selectors, because these are the types of things that you will be able to write in your style sheet to affect particular elements on the page. And as you look through this HTML over here, you're going to see a class and an ID on just about every element on the page. And there's also comments in here that tell you what you can target and how they would recommend you targeting some of the content. So was that helpful here? Let me see what people replied to. Do you have to do the exercises to turn in that's in the Lynda program? No, you don't have to turn in anything from lynda.com. It's a long course, and I honestly don't want you to watch every video, but I do want you to poke around with some. And if the Lynda videos inspire you to write some HTML and CSS, the practice would be good for you. Selectors are the hardest concept in the whole web design class. So what I'm trying different this semester is to give you practice this week in the journal at actually looking at the CSS Zen Garden designs to get a feel for what classes and IDs you can write selectors for. And for the journal this week, I just want you to copy some of these selectors in and describe what that was selecting and what they changed on the page. So I think that was it inside of the journal here. Remember in a journal that you should talk about what you've been working on, what challenges you faced, what you learned, that type of thing. I think that's it for tonight, everyone. Are there any other questions about this journal? It really is supposed to be like a scavenger hunt. You know, look at a bunch of designs, pick one you like, figure out what makes it tick with the web inspector. So selector, someone's asking what a selector is, and they pasted in an example of dot selector equals thing. That, I mean, what you wrote is technically a selector, but let me go back to the Zen Garden. Actually, you know what would be better? Let's go back to this style sheet that I wrote today. You saw me write this. Every one of these CSS rules that I wrote has a selector. This is the selector where it says nav A. This is a selector. This is called a descendant selector because I'm actually selecting something underneath another element. I'm selecting all the anchor tags underneath the nav element. So this is an example of a descendant selector. Down here where I selected just the UL, that is an element selector because I am just selecting the UL element. If this was real CSS that I was going to use on a website, I probably wouldn't want to change all of the ULs to have no bullet points because I'm probably going to have another UL on the page that I want to be bulleted. Like, what if what if the other part of my page was like, let's make an H2, my favorite things. If I actually put an li in here, let's say gum, and let's say candy. If I refresh this page, my poor unordered list doesn't look like an unordered list anymore. So how can I change my CSS to not be so greedy and select all the ULs? Well, I could write a selector. So I could actually say that I want to select all the ULs that have a class of navbar. Or let's call them nav links. So I can add this dot nav links, and then this becomes a class selector. So what I need to do is make sure that in my HTML, I actually put a class on my UL called navlinks. So when I refresh the page, you'll see that apparently I wrote some other CSS in here that I need to include. I need to make sure that I don't select all the LIs. I think that'll do it for me. Yeah, there we go. So I needed to make sure that I selected just the right UL and just the right LIs. So this is now a class selector. I could leave off the UL bit and it would be anything that has a class of navlinks. This is a more complicated child selector because it has a class selector in it and then an element selector. So this is what I want you to pay attention to in the Zen Garden, are these parts of the CSS rules, the selectors. So the dot, as we talked about, means class. The other one that you'll see very common is an ID. So the thing would correspond with something that has an ID of the thing. Let's make the thing red. The ID can only be one thing on the page. They're not used as frequently as the Zen Garden makes it look like. I mean, everything in the Zen Garden, because they wanted it to be the most flexible HTML for you to work with, they put an ID and a class on every element so that you can always grab it with something. But for the purposes of your midterm project, a huge emphasis is going to be on writing a variety of selectors. So writing a class selector, a descendant selector, an ID selector. And so if you can find an example of those in the Zen Garden this week, you will be good to go. Are there any other questions tonight? So just to recap, we talked about the box model. We showed the box model in action when we built our, decent passable navbar. And we talked about the wonderful Zen Garden and how you're going to browse through the Zen Garden to find a design or two that you like and talk about them and how they're built with the Web Inspector. Let me ask for questions one more time. While I'm waiting for questions, did anyone have any comments about the color lecture last week? Have you been able to watch the whole video? I know we had audio and camera challenges, but content-wise, is there any feedback that I can give Anthony? I know that he really likes hearing back from students. All right, someone said that it was an alright video, just might want to be more used to being on camera. Yeah, the camera was interesting. We had used an external camera, like a real video camcorder, but that's what caused like the pixelation every once in a while. After about 30 seconds of being plugged into my computer, the camera would start being weird. So I ended up actually using like a little. I actually ended up using my phone as the camera because I was using that as a wireless camera that could go inside of the box. And that worked a lot better, except I had to hold it for part of the video, and so you'll see it shake a little bit. And eventually I figured out how to prop up the camera so it was steady by the end. And I think the thing that took us out of the flow was, I mean, it happens here at night where there's a delay between when I say something and when feedback comes in the chat room. And we had that delay when people were saying that the microphone had stopped working. The batteries had died in our microphone at one point, and every time I switched between video inputs, it would lose where the audio source was coming from. So by the end, you'll see that I got used to that, and I would fix it right away as we were switching scenes. But we learned a lot, and I think I would probably simplify the setup for next time we do this. So thank you for watching it. Thank you for watching tonight, everybody. And I look forward to looking at the CSS Zen Garden designs that you're interested in your journals this week. Thanks, everybody.